A storm had rolled down from the mountains, heavy and unrelenting, swallowing the world in sheets of silver rain. In that storm, an Apache woman walked alone, guiding a herd of lean, restless cattle through mud that clung to her skirts like sorrow. Her shawl was soaked through, her long black hair plastered to her cheeks. She whispered low to the animals, her voice trembling between command and prayer. The woman was 27, her hands rough from years of work, her eyes darker than the clouds above her. She had built her small corral near a dry riverbed. A foolish choice, some would have said, but it was the only land left where no one came to mock her. The settlers avoided her. The tribe no longer claimed her. Once she had a husband who believed love could bridge those two worlds, but bullets and men's judgment had taken him before his time. Since then, she had not spoken her name aloud. She spoke only to her cattle and the sky. Rain stung her face as she tried to pull a rope around the youngest calf, which had slipped in the mud. The creature kicked, frightened, and her feet slid. She fell to her knees, catching herself with open palms that sank deep into the muck. The ground was cold enough to numb her fingers, but she held on, teeth gritted, until the calf stumbled to its feet again. For a heartbeat she stayed kneeling, chest heaving, her breath visible in the chill. Then she rose, wiping her hands on her skirt, and pushed forward through the curtain of rain. Her shelter waited at the edge of the field, a crude structure of wood and canvas that shuddered with each gust of wind. The walls bowed inward like a heart too tired to stand. She'd mended it many times, but the weather had its own will. Tonight it would not hold. Her cattle pressed against the fence, bawling in fear. She untied her shawl and tried to cover the smallest one, though the effort was useless. The rain seeped through everything, even the strongest resolve. She looked toward the open plain, toward where the earth curved away into gray distance. There was no light, only thunder, only her and the sound of hooves drowning in mud. Her throat tightened with a kind of anger that had no direction, at God, at men, at the quiet indifference of the land. Yet still she whispered, steadying the animals, her voice a thread of calm spun from habit more than hope. Then came a noise she did not expect, the groan of wagon wheels. She turned sharply, her heart jolting. Through the blur of rain, a figure emerged from the far ridge. A horse-drawn wagon crept closer, its driver leaning forward against the downpour. As it neared, the woman saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, the brim of his hat dripping water, his oilskin coat shining like obsidian. He guided the horses to a stop a few yards away. Henry was 31, a man carved by solitude and weather. He had buried his wife 2 winters ago, and had since spoken little. Folks said his grief had turned to stone somewhere behind his ribs. Yet here he was, watching her fight the storm with bare hands and torn willpower. His gaze lingered, not with pity, but with something quieter. Recognition, maybe. He had known what it meant to lose the shelter of a soul. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind filled the silence, rattling the corral and whipping the rain sideways. She stood straight, though trembling, her chin lifted as if daring him to see her shame. The cattle huddled behind her, half submerged in the mire. Henry climbed down from his wagon, boots sinking ankle-deep, and without asking, pushed a fallen fence post back into the ground. She watched, uncertain, her hands clutching the rope. He worked quickly, driving the post with measured strikes until it stood firm again. When he was done, he met her eyes. She tried to thank him, but her voice was lost to the rain. He glanced at the sagging shelter, then back at her, his expression unreadable, but his meaning clear. He said only, "Come with me." Not an order, not a mercy, a statement of truth, heavy as thunder and just as final. She froze. The words hung between them, impossible and yet irresistible. She had learned to mistrust the kindness of men. It often came with debt. But there was something different in his tone, something that felt like an invitation to safety, not ownership. Behind him, the wagon waited, a faint light flickering from its lantern. Another gust tore through the canvas of her shelter, ripping it free. The sound broke her hesitation. She looked back at what little she owned, a crumbling wall, a wet fire pit, the dying embers of her independence, and then forward to him. The choice was not easy, but it was clear. She took the first step. Then another. Henry turned and began tying the ropes that would lead her cattle to his ranch. She joined him, their hands brushing once, brief, unplanned. The warmth of his skin startled her. Neither spoke as they worked side by side, the storm battering them but no longer winning. Together they led the herd up the slope, toward the hills. When she slipped again on the climb, his hand caught her arm, steadying her. The touch lingered only for a breath, but it held a promise unspoken, that not all strength must stand alone. By the time they reached the ridge, the rain had softened to mist. She turned back. Her old corral was half underwater now, her shelter gone. Yet instead of grief, she felt something lighter, like exhaling after years of holding breath. Henry led the horses onward, the dim outline of his ranch visible in the distance. She followed, her steps slow, her heart still unsure of what waited. When the clouds finally broke, a shaft of pale sunlight fell across them, illuminating the mud on her hands and the faint curve of his shoulder ahead. For the first time in many years, she didn't feel invisible. The storm had taken everything she built, but in its ruin, it had given her a direction. The world smelled of clean soil and wet cedar, the air heavy with the hush that follows endurance. The Apache woman awoke on a narrow cot inside Henry's ranch house, wrapped in a quilt older than she was. Firelight flickered against log walls, painting her skin in amber. For a moment, she didn't move, listening to the quiet creak of the place, the sigh of wind at the windows, the slow rhythm of a man moving somewhere beyond the doorway. She sat up carefully, her hair loose around her shoulders, her mind caught between fear and disbelief. The room was warm, too warm for someone who'd grown used to cold. Outside, she could hear her cattle shifting in the barn, safe. That small sound alone was enough to loosen something in her chest. Henry's voice came from the next room, calm and low. He was tending the stove, his movements steady as though he'd done it 1,000 mornings alone. He didn't turn when she stepped into view, only gestured toward a mug on the table. Steam rose from it in faint spirals. She hesitated before taking it, holding the tin between her palms as if testing whether she belonged to this warmth. They spoke little. Words felt fragile here. He asked if the cattle made it through the night, and she nodded. Her voice came soft, uncertain, as if unused to being heard indoors. He told her she could stay until the roads dried, his tone practical, but beneath it ran a note of quiet insistence that sounded almost like care. The hours unfolded slow. She moved through the house with careful hands, wiping mud from her skirts, sweeping the hearth, mending what she could. The small chores steadied her. Every now and then, she'd glance at him, this man who'd offered shelter without asking her to explain the weight she carried. His face, though stern, held no judgment. It was the kind of silence that made space for breathing. At noon, the sun returned, gilding the hills with a fragile brightness. They walked together to the barn. The cattle lowed contentedly, their hides steaming in the sudden warmth. She ran her hand over the nearest one's neck, murmuring in her language, a lullaby of thanks. Henry watched, arms folded, his eyes softened by something he didn't try to name. He asked how long she'd been alone. She gave no number. Instead, she said, long enough for silence to start speaking back. That made him look away, as if the words had found an old echo inside him. Later, as evening settled, he sat on the porch mending a saddle strap while she washed the dirt from a pail. The sky burned copper. They didn't need to fill the air with talk. Their quiet had its own language. Yet beneath that quiet lay a slow current neither of them wanted to disturb, a recognition, a shared kind of solitude beginning to braid into something gentler. When riders from town appeared on the trail, that calm cracked. 3 men, soaked and sour-faced, called out Henry's name. They'd come to see the woman they'd heard about, the one who'd been living alone by the river, the one they didn't think belonged. Their eyes were sharp with suspicion, the kind that always looks for fault in someone else's skin. Henry rose, stepping down from a porch. The woman froze beside the well, one hand still gripping the rope. The men sneered, asking if he'd taken in strays now, if he'd forgotten what folks in town thought decent. For a moment, the tension thickened like the air before lightning. Henry's reply was quiet but immovable. He said she was under his roof, and anyone who disrespected her disrespected him. His voice didn't rise, yet it cut through the dusk like steel through fabric. The men exchanged looks, muttered curses, and turned their horses away. When they were gone, the woman stood motionless, the wind stirring the ends of her shawl. She had seen kindness before, but never defense. Her throat tightened. He met her gaze only once before turning back to the porch, but that glance said everything. "You're safe here." Night returned with stars bright as frost. She stepped outside after he'd gone to bed, barefoot on the damp boards, listening to the cattle breathe in the dark. The land smelled new again, washed clean. She thought of the words he'd said, simple, ordinary, yet heavier than all the pity she'd endured. Under his roof. When she returned inside, she found him awake still, sitting by the fire with a book in his lap, unread. He looked up, and their eyes caught in that uncertain space between gratitude and something deeper. She said softly that she would leave when the sky cleared for good. He didn't argue. He only said, "The door will stay open." The days that followed stretched calm and bright. They worked side by side, repairing fences, her laugh returning little by little. Once, while bringing water to a newborn calf, her hand brushed his. Neither withdrew. The silence afterward felt less like emptiness and more like promise. As the final test of the bond forming between them, a storm of another kind came one night, the cry of a laboring cow in distress. She and Henry ran barefoot through the mud, breath clouding in the cold, their hands slick with effort as they pulled the calf free. For a terrible moment it didn't move. Then, with one trembling gasp, it lived. The woman's laughter broke into the rain-soaked air, raw and bright. Henry stood still, chest rising fast, watching her with something close to awe. She turned toward him, eyes shining through tears and mud, and said simply, "It lived." And in her voice, he heard his own heart begin again. When dawn came, they sat side by side outside the barn, clothes wet, faces warmed by the rising light. The sky was clear, endless, forgiving. She looked at him, then really looked, and knew that some storms end not in ruin, but in homecoming.